Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a close look at indigenous rights in Mexico.
Definitely a topic with a lot of layers to uncover.
For sure. And we've got some super interesting source material for this one. Academic papers,
hmm
legal documents, even some insights into how researchers are tackling this whole area of study. It's fascinating stuff. But before we get too deep, I think it's worth laying out the big question we're trying to answer here. How does Mexico define indigenous identity? And what rights come with that identity? It's more than just checking a box on a form, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's way more nuanced than that. Mexico uses this concept called autoadscription, which is essentially means self-identification.
Okay, so it starts with individuals claiming their own identity.
Right. It recognizes that identity comes from within, but of course there are legal and social challenges that come with that.
Makes sense. So how does that personal declaration fit into, say, the government's framework? They have to have some official guidelines, don't they?
Oh, they absolutely do. We've got Articles 2 of the Mexican Constitution and then Convention 169 from the International Labor Organization. Both of these touch on indigenous rights. But the challenge is, how do you translate these broad principles into policies that actually work for the huge diversity of indigenous communities in Mexico? It's a balancing act, to say the least.
And you can't ignore the historical context either. Indigenous populations in Mexico haven't always been treated fairly, so I imagine that history plays a big role in how rights are recognized and implemented today.
You hit the nail on the head. History definitely informs the present. Recognizing indigenous rights isn't just about laws, it's about shifting power dynamics and respecting cultural autonomy. It's about acknowledging past wrongs.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of specifics, the sources actually lay out criteria for legally determining indigenous identity. So it's not as simple as just saying, I'm indigenous. There's more to it, right?
Yeah. Right. It's not just a declaration. You need to belong to a recognized indigenous community and then demonstrate knowledge of that community's institutions, their social structures, economic systems, cultural practices, and political structures.
So there's an element of community validation involved, not just personal declaration.
Exactly. And on top of that, you need to prove that you've contributed to the community, whether through service or holding a traditional position.
Wow, so there's a real emphasis on being an active member of the community, not just claiming an identity.
You got it. And all of this leads to this concept called qualified indigenous self-identification, something established by the Superior Chamber of the Electoral Tribunal. It was put in place to ensure authentic representation in politics, but it can also have some unintended consequences. Imagine someone who truly identifies as indigenous, but doesn't meet all of the criteria; they could be excluded.
That sounds like a tough situation to navigate. Balancing individual identity with protecting the system from being manipulated.
Exactly. And it's a perfect segue to our next point. Simply saying Mexico is diverse doesn't even begin to cover it.
Right, we need to go deeper than that.
Exactly. The sources use a few specific terms to help us understand the nuances of that diversity, like multiculturalism, pluriculturalism, and interculturalism. I know those words can sound a bit jargony.
They do. I was hoping you could break those down for us.
I'm happy to. These aren't just academic terms, they have real-world implications. Multiculturalism acknowledges that multiple cultures exist within a society, but it doesn't necessarily mean they all have equal power or interact equally.
So kind of like a salad bowl. Different ingredients tossed together, but each keeps its own distinct flavor.
That's the classic analogy. Now, pluriculturalism takes it a step further. It suggests that these cultures are actually interwoven, actively contributing to a shared cultural fabric. Imagine a tapestry where diverse threads come together to create a unified whole.
Okay, I'm starting to see the difference. Multiculturalism acknowledges difference, while pluriculturalism sees how those differences connect and contribute to something larger.
You got it. Now we have interculturalism, which emphasizes the active engagement and dialogue between different cultures.
So it's about going beyond just tolerance and moving toward mutual understanding and collaboration.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have something to learn from each other. And in the context of indigenous rights in Mexico, it's about moving beyond simply acknowledging their existence and actually engaging with their cultures and respecting their legal systems. It's about making sure they have a genuine voice in shaping the country's future.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And speaking of respecting their legal systems, let's dive into the world of indigenous legal systems in Mexico. It's mind-blowing to think about communities settling disputes not in a courtroom, but through traditions that are often passed down orally.
It's a fascinating concept. Imagine a community where justice focuses on restoring balance and harmony, often guided by elders and rooted in deep-seated customs. It's not just about different laws, it's about an entirely different approach to understanding conflict and resolving it.
It's like stepping into a different reality, where justice isn't just about punishment, but about healing the community.
Exactly. These systems are known as internal normative systems, and they're crucial to indigenous communities because they reflect their values and understanding of justice.
So how do these systems work in practice? Are there specific rules or guidelines they follow?
They have their own principles, procedures, and institutions. Their principles are their core values, often emphasizing community well-being, restorative justice, and maintaining balance with nature.
That's definitely different from what we see in Western legal systems.
Right. And then their procedures outline how conflicts are addressed. It often involves things like mediation, community assemblies, or consultations with traditional leaders.
Fascinating. And what about the institutions?
The institutions are the bodies that hold authority, like community councils, elders, or spiritual leaders.
I see. So this all sounds pretty self-contained, but how do these internal systems interact with the national legal system? Do they ever clash? And how are those situations handled?
That's the million-dollar question. Article 16 of the Mexican Constitution does recognize the right of indigenous communities to apply their own systems, but there's a catch. Those systems can't violate fundamental human rights or go against national law.
Ah, so there are limits.
There are. It's about finding that balance between indigenous self-determination and the state's authority.
And have there been real-world examples of this playing out?
Oh, absolutely. There are cases where communities have successfully used their own legal systems to deal with things like land disputes, manage natural resources, and even address offenses within their communities. But then, of course, you have situations where things get tricky when internal norms clash with national law or when communities feel like their rights aren't being fully respected by the state.
Right, so it's an ongoing process of negotiation and dialogue.
Exactly. It's about finding ways to reconcile different legal systems while still upholding the rights of indigenous communities. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of indigenous rights, protecting their cultural identity. It's not just about legal recognition, it's about cultural survival.
Absolutely. And both Article 2 of the Mexican Constitution and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples address the right to preserve cultural identity. But what does that actually mean in practice? It's not just symbolic, right?
Oh, not at all. We're talking about protecting the core elements of indigenous cultures that are essential for their well-being and even their survival. Things like language, traditional knowledge, arts, rituals, spiritual practices, and even their relationship with their ancestral lands.
Right, because in a world that's becoming more and more homogenous, those unique elements are under constant threat. Losing them would be a huge loss for humanity's cultural heritage.
Absolutely. And you can't ignore the challenges these communities face in protecting that heritage. Often they lack resources, legal support, and even basic recognition from the broader society.
It's heartbreaking when those challenges come not from abstract forces, but from specific actors. Like those cases we see in the sources where big companies exploit indigenous designs for profit without permission or even acknowledging where they came from. Those classic David and Goliath battles.
Exactly. Cases like Isabel Marant using mixed designs, Nestlé using Tenango de Doria patterns, Nike with designs inspired by the Raramuri and Tarahumara, all without proper recognition. It's infuriating, to say the least.
It really is. What recourse do these communities even have? What can be done to stop this exploitation?
Well, legally, there are intellectual property laws that can offer some protection, but those laws are often inadequate or difficult to enforce, especially for communities that lack the resources to navigate complex legal systems.
So what can be done?
A lot of it comes down to us, the consumers. We need to be more aware, ask questions, do our research, and support brands that engage in ethical collaborations, not exploitative appropriation.
That's a powerful message. It's about making conscious choices and using our purchasing power to support what's right. So we've talked about legal frameworks, cultural protection, and ethical considerations. But I'm curious about the research itself. How are people studying indigenous rights in Mexico? What are the methodologies?
I'm glad you asked that. The sources actually offer some insights into the research process. They really emphasize the need for ethical considerations, community engagement, and respect for indigenous knowledge systems.
Because you can't just study these communities from the outside looking in.
Exactly. You need to build relationships, listen to their perspectives, and make sure the research actually benefits the communities being studied. It's about shifting away from extractive research, where you just come in, grab data, and leave, and moving towards a more collaborative approach, something that's reciprocal and beneficial.
Makes sense. So what does that look like in practice?
It's about using culturally sensitive methods, participatory approaches, and what's called decolonized research.
Decolonized research. What does that mean in this context?
It means challenging the power dynamics that are often baked into traditional research, the kind of research that prioritizes Western knowledge systems and perspectives. It recognizes that Indigenous communities have their own unique ways of knowing and understanding the world, and those ways of knowing deserve respect.
So it's about leveling the playing field, recognizing different forms of knowledge as valid.
Exactly. It's about making research a tool for empowerment, not exploitation, which aligns perfectly with everything we've been talking about today.
I love that. So we've talked about research methods, but what about the actual legal tools being used to advance indigenous rights in Mexico?
There are a few key concepts that are really important to understand. One is the idea of acciones afirmativas, which is basically affirmative action.
Okay, and what does that look like in the context of indigenous rights?
It means implementing policies designed to address historical injustices and create greater equality by providing benefits to groups that have been marginalized, like reserving seats in Parliament for Indigenous representatives or providing scholarships for Indigenous students. It's about leveling the playing field, recognizing that true equality might require different treatment to account for past inequalities.
Right, because just saying everyone is equal under the law doesn't magically erase the effects of centuries of discrimination.
You got it. It's about taking concrete steps to undo the damage of the past. And the sources highlight several examples of how affirmative action has been used effectively to advance Indigenous rights in Mexico.
Can you give us an example?
Well, for example, there have been quotas established for Indigenous representation in political bodies, and that's helped increase the number of Indigenous voices in decision-making positions. Their perspectives are finally being considered.
So it's not just about having a voice. It's about having a seat at the table where decisions are being made.
Precisely. And there are other examples, too, in areas like education, healthcare, and economic development. Programs tailored to address the specific needs of Indigenous communities and promote greater social and economic justice.
It's about creating a system that recognizes their unique challenges and provides support.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial legal concept, the right to consulta, or consultation. It's a fundamental right, meaning Indigenous people have the right to be consulted and give their consent to any projects or policies that might affect their lands, territories, or resources.
Okay, so it's about more than just being informed. It's about having a genuine say in decisions that directly affect their lives and their futures.
Absolutely. It recognizes that Indigenous peoples aren't just stakeholders, they're rights holders. Their voices and perspectives need to be taken seriously.
But I can imagine that ensuring genuine and meaningful consultation can be quite challenging.
Yeah.
It can't just be a box-ticking exercise.
You're absolutely right. The sources dive into some of those challenges, emphasizing the need for clear guidelines, good faith negotiations, and culturally appropriate ways of communicating. You can't just consult with Indigenous communities without respecting their customs, languages, and decision-making processes.
It's about meeting them where they are, so to speak, and engaging with them on their terms.
Exactly. And the sources highlight examples of both good and bad consultation practices.
Can you give us an example of when it's been done well?
Sure. There have been cases where consultation led to agreements that benefited both Indigenous communities and the wider society. For example, in the development of some mining projects, Indigenous communities were consulted, and they were able to negotiate agreements that protected their environment and their cultural interests while still allowing for economic development to happen.
So it's about finding a balance, a way to reconcile different interests and find solutions that work for everyone involved.
Precisely. But on the flip side, there have also been cases where consultation was poorly implemented, and that led to conflict, mistrust, and even violence. So it's a delicate process that requires careful planning, sensitivity, and a genuine commitment to finding solutions that work for all parties involved. But moving on, there's another important aspect of Indigenous rights we need to discuss: recognizing and protecting their unique knowledge systems.
We've touched on that throughout our conversation. Indigenous cultures have this incredibly deep understanding of their environment, their history, and their own ways of life.
Right. And that knowledge is valuable in its own right, but it's also incredibly relevant to addressing some of the most pressing challenges facing humanity today. Climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequality, you name it. Absolutely. It's not just about preserving the past. It's about drawing on that Indigenous wisdom to create a better future for everyone.
That's a powerful thought. But practically speaking, how do you protect something as intangible as knowledge?
It involves a variety of approaches. Things like legally recognizing intellectual property rights or creating biocultural heritage areas where indigenous knowledge is respected and valued. But it also requires challenging the dominant Western paradigm that often dismisses indigenous knowledge as primitive or unscientific.
We need to move away from that hierarchical view of knowledge and embrace a more pluralistic understanding that recognizes the value of different ways of knowing.
Right, exactly. And the sources really drive this point home. Indigenous knowledge isn't just folklore. It's a sophisticated system of understanding the world that's been developed and refined over centuries of observation, experimentation, and adaptation. It's a system that we can all learn from.
Well said. Now let's zoom in on a specific aspect of indigenous knowledge that often gets misunderstood and misrepresented: traditional medicine.
Traditional medicine is a fascinating and complex topic, and the sources really delve into the key issues surrounding its recognition, protection, and how to integrate it into the broader healthcare system.
Because on the one hand, we hear about the potential of traditional medicine healing, preventing disease, promoting well-being, drawing on all that accumulated knowledge about plants, animals, the human body.
Right, and on the other hand, you have the concerns from the modern medical establishment about safety, efficacy, the need for scientific validation.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we respect and value traditional medicine while also making sure it's used safely and responsibly?
That's the key question, and it's a complex one. The sources discuss several different approaches, from licensing traditional healers to incorporating traditional remedies into modern pharmaceutical research.
It sounds like it's about finding ways to bridge those different systems of knowledge and practice, recognizing that both have something valuable to offer.
Exactly. And ultimately, it comes down to respecting the right of indigenous peoples to choose their own healthcare options, whether that's traditional medicine, modern medicine, or a combination of both.
It's about empowering individuals and communities to make the best choices for their own health and well-being.
Well said. And speaking of empowerment, we need to talk about the right of indigenous communities to have control over their own resources.
This has been a recurring theme throughout our conversation, but I think it's worth exploring further.
Absolutely. For many indigenous communities, their lands, territories, and resources aren't just a source of livelihood. They're fundamentally connected to their cultural identities, spiritual beliefs, and their way of life.
Right, and the sources really highlight the importance of recognizing those rights. It's not just about economic justice. It's about cultural survival and environmental sustainability.
Exactly. Because when communities lose control of their resources, they often lose control over their own destinies. And the sources discuss various approaches to addressing this, like legally recognizing traditional land tenure systems or establishing co-management agreements with the state.
It's about finding ways to make sure these communities have a real voice in how their resources are managed, and that they actually benefit from the sustainable use of those resources.
You got it. And we have to remember, indigenous knowledge and practices are often essential for managing resources sustainably and protecting biodiversity. These communities have a deep connection to their environment and a long history of living in balance with nature.
And in a world facing so many environmental challenges, that knowledge is invaluable.
Couldn't agree more. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to bring up another important topic, one that can be a bit controversial: extractive industries operating on or near indigenous lands.
Oh yeah, mining, oil, gas. Those industries often spark heated debate.
They do, and for good reason. It's a complex issue. On one hand, these industries can bring economic development and jobs, but on the other hand, they can also bring environmental degradation, disrupt cultures, and even lead to social conflict.
It's about finding that balance between the potential economic benefits and the need to protect both the environment and the rights of the communities involved.
Exactly. And the sources talk about different approaches to trying to achieve this balance: impact assessments, revenue sharing agreements, and crucially, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent.
Because we know that when extractive industries operate without respecting indigenous rights, the consequences can be devastating.
They can be, and the sources provide several examples of this, unfortunately. We see cases where mining, oil and gas projects have led to displacement, loss of livelihoods, environmental contamination, and cultural disruption. It's a sensitive issue that requires careful consideration and a genuine commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone.
It sounds like we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've gone from defining indigenous identity and unpacking complex legal ideas to examining challenges like cultural appropriation. It's clear that the fight for indigenous rights is multifaceted and far from over.
It certainly is. And while we've delved into some important aspects, we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore. We haven't even touched on things like technology, the importance of international solidarity, or the broader trends and challenges facing Indigenous rights today, both in Mexico and around the world.
It sounds like we have a lot more to unpack in our next session.
We do, but for now, let's give our listeners a chance to process everything we've covered so far. We'll be back soon to continue this fascinating exploration of Indigenous rights in Mexico.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Welcome back. We were talking about the impact of those big extractive industries on Indigenous communities before the break, really a sensitive issue, and the sources we're looking at really emphasize how important it is to ensure these industries actually operate in a way that benefits those communities, not just the companies themselves.
Right, it's about balancing economic development with protecting people's rights and the environment.
And speaking of balancing, I'm curious about the role of technology in all of this. It seems like technology could be used to either help or hurt the fight for Indigenous rights.
Absolutely. It's a double-edged sword. It has the power to both empower and marginalize, depending on how it's used. But one really exciting thing I've seen in the sources is how digital platforms are being used to share stories, document traditional knowledge, and raise awareness about Indigenous issues.
So, like giving a voice to those who might not otherwise be heard.
Exactly. We see some amazing Indigenous-led media initiatives highlighted in the sources, things like online radio stations, documentaries, social media campaigns. It's not just about broadcasting information. It's about creating a space for dialogue and cultural exchange, building a sense of community.
Like building a digital bridge between different worlds. I love that analogy. And the sources also talk about using technology for language revitalization, mapping cultural sites, even monitoring the environment, all of which are so important for Indigenous self-determination and cultural survival.
It sounds like technology can be a powerful tool for these communities to reclaim control, preserve their traditions, shape their future.
It definitely can. But there are also challenges, of course. Access to technology isn't equal. A lot of Indigenous communities face barriers when it comes to connectivity, digital literacy, and the resources they need to use technology effectively.
So it's not as simple as just handing them a smartphone and saying, go for it.
No, not at all. You need to equip these communities with the knowledge, the skills, the support they need to use technology in a way that actually benefits them. And then there are the ethical considerations. Technology could be used to exploit Indigenous cultures or even misrepresent them if it's not used thoughtfully.
Right. That potential for cultural appropriation is a real concern.
It is. It reminds us that technology is just a tool. Like any tool, it can be used responsibly or irresponsibly. We need to be mindful of that.
Okay, so we talked about the role of technology, but what about international solidarity? It seems like the fight for Indigenous rights is global, something that requires collaboration across borders.
Absolutely. The sources really emphasize this. International organizations, human rights advocates, Indigenous communities around the world, they all play a crucial role in supporting each other, sharing strategies, amplifying their voices on a global stage. There's strength in numbers, and when Indigenous peoples unite, they can be a real force for change.
And have there been cases where that international solidarity has led to real positive change?
Oh, there are several examples. Just look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That wouldn't have happened without the work of Indigenous groups and their allies from all over the world.
It's inspiring to see people from different cultures and backgrounds coming together to fight for justice and equality.
It is. It reminds us that we're all connected, that the struggle for Indigenous rights is a shared one. But now I think it's time we zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. What are some of the key trends and challenges facing Indigenous rights, both in Mexico and globally?
That's a big question. Where do you see this fight headed in the years to come?
Well, one encouraging trend I see is the growing recognition of Indigenous rights in both national and international law. More and more, we're seeing laws, treaties, court decisions that affirm the rights of Indigenous peoples to things like self-determination, cultural integrity, control over their lands and resources.
That sounds promising. But I imagine actually turning those legal victories into real change on the ground is another battle altogether.
You're right. Just because rights are recognized on paper doesn't mean they're automatically respected or implemented. There are still significant obstacles that these communities face.
Like what? What are some of the biggest challenges they still have to overcome?
Well, one of the biggest is systemic discrimination. It's baked into so many aspects of society. access to education, healthcare, employment, political representation. And then there's the ongoing issue of resources. Not enough funding, not enough support for indigenous communities and the things they're trying to do.
So even when the laws are there, they're not always backed up by the resources needed to make them effective.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have the ongoing conflicts over land and resources. Indigenous communities are often pushed off their ancestral lands, lands that are essential to their cultural identity and how they make a living. These are often battles against powerful economic interests, which leaves these communities vulnerable to exploitation and displacement.
It sounds like a very complex web of challenges. It must take a multi-pronged approach to address these issues effectively.
It does. We need legal reforms, policy changes, increased funding. But it also requires a shift in how society views Indigenous peoples and how power is distributed.
It's about recognizing their inherent rights and creating a society where they have a real voice, their cultures are respected, and their right to self-determination is upheld. It's about changing hearts and minds, not just laws.
Couldn't said it better myself.
Hmm.
And speaking of changing hearts and minds, we can't ignore the legacy of colonialism. It continues to impact Indigenous communities in profound ways.
We've mentioned colonialism throughout this deep dive, but I think it's worth explicitly addressing its lasting impact.
I agree. Colonialism wasn't just a historical event. It's an ongoing system of oppression that continues to affect Indigenous peoples around the world. Loss of land and resources, suppression of languages and cultures, the erosion of traditional knowledge systems, these are all part of its legacy.
And it's led to the marginalization and discrimination that so many Indigenous communities still face today. It's like a wound that hasn't fully healed.
That's a powerful image. And decolonization is not just about land restitution or political independence. It's about dismantling the structures of power and privilege that keep those colonial legacies alive.
So it's about reclaiming Indigenous histories and cultures, challenging the dominant narratives, and creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Absolutely. And one of the key tools for that is the concept of interculturality, which we discussed earlier. It's about moving beyond simply recognizing rights and working toward a society where different cultures can coexist and thrive based on mutual respect, understanding, and reciprocity.
It's about building bridges, breaking down those barriers, creating a more inclusive world.
Exactly. Interculturality is an ongoing process. It requires dialogue, critical reflection, challenging our own assumptions and biases. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in this, whether we're policymakers, educators, activists, or just concerned citizens.
The fight for Indigenous rights isn't just about Indigenous peoples. It's about creating a better world for all of us.
That's right. A world where diversity is celebrated, justice prevails, and everyone can live in dignity and harmony.
That's a beautiful vision and something worth fighting for, even if the road is long and difficult. But speaking of challenges, one thing I'm realizing we haven't talked much about is the role of women in the fight for Indigenous rights. It seems like they must face unique challenges and contribute so much to this movement.
You're absolutely right. Indigenous women often face a double burden of discrimination, both as Indigenous peoples and as women. They're marginalized within their own communities and by the broader society, yet they're often at the forefront of these struggles. Protecting land, preserving traditions, advocating for social justice, they play a vital role.
So they're both guardians of their cultures and agents of change.
Exactly. And the sources emphasize how important it is to recognize and support the leadership of Indigenous women. Their voices and perspectives are essential if we want to achieve real equality and justice.
Now, switching gears a bit, I want to touch on something that's been on my mind throughout this whole conversation. The link between Indigenous rights and environmental protection. There seems to be a really strong connection there.
Oh, absolutely. It's a deep and profound connection. Indigenous people have lived in harmony with nature for centuries. They've developed sustainable practices, built this incredible knowledge of the ecosystems they inhabit. And in their worldview, humans are interconnected with the natural world. They're not separate from it.
So it's not just about protecting the environment for the sake of the environment. It's about recognizing that Indigenous people's rights to their lands and resources are fundamentally tied to their cultural and spiritual well-being.
Exactly. When Indigenous rights are respected, the environment benefits. And when the environment is protected, Indigenous cultures and livelihoods are protected. It's a beautiful symbiotic relationship. And the sources provide tons of examples of how Indigenous communities are leading the way in environmental conservation, protecting forests and waterways, restoring ecosystems, advocating for climate action. They're on the front lines.
It's really inspiring to see them taking such a leadership role in the fight for a healthy planet.
It is. Now, I know this is a bit of a heavier topic, but I think it's important to address racism and discrimination against Indigenous peoples.
It's definitely not an easy conversation to have, but ignoring it won't make it go away. So how do the sources we're looking at approach this sensitive issue?
They acknowledge that racism and discrimination are deeply ingrained in many societies and that Indigenous peoples continue to face prejudice, stereotyping, and just systemic inequalities.
And that can manifest in a lot of different ways, from overt hate speech and violence to more subtle forms of exclusion.
Absolutely. And the sources really emphasize the importance of confronting racism in all its forms and working towards a society that's more just and equitable, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
That sounds like a challenging task, but a crucial one. So what are some effective strategies for combating racism and discrimination against Indigenous peoples?
Education is definitely key. It's about challenging those stereotypes and promoting understanding and appreciation for Indigenous cultures and histories. It's also about supporting initiatives led by Indigenous peoples and amplifying their voices in all areas of society.
It's about making sure they're not seen as relics of the past, but as vital contributors to our present and future.
Exactly. And it's about ensuring equal access to opportunities, resources, and justice. It's a long and complex road, but it's a journey we need to take.
I agree. Now, before we move on to our final segment, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the importance of language revitalization.
Yep.
We talked about the role language plays in cultural identity, but what are some of the specific challenges and opportunities facing Indigenous languages in Mexico?
That's a great question. Many Indigenous languages in Mexico are endangered. Assimilation, globalization, lack of support for intergenerational language transmission, these are all putting pressure on them. And when a language is lost, we lose so much more than just words. We lose cultural knowledge, history, a whole way of seeing the world.
It's like losing a piece of that beautiful tapestry of human diversity.
Exactly. But the good news is there are amazing efforts underway to revitalize these languages in Mexico. Community-based programs, bilingual education, using technology to document and share languages. It's about giving Indigenous communities the tools and the power to reclaim their linguistic heritage.
It's a reminder that language is so much more than just a means of communication. It's a carrier of culture, identity, a unique way of seeing the world.
Couldn't agree more.
It's amazing to see all the work being done to revitalize these languages. Now, I know we've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff today, but I want to end on a bit of a lighter note. The sources mentioned something called Indigenous humor, and I gotta say, I'm intrigued. What's that all about?
Oh, it's fantastic. Indigenous humor is this rich tradition, really diverse, and it often reflects those unique experiences, perspectives, and resilience of Indigenous communities.
So it's more than just telling jokes.
Oh, way more. It's about using humor to address social issues, challenge stereotypes, and cope with adversity. It can be satirical, witty, ironic, sometimes even a bit dark. It's a way of expressing cultural identity and reclaiming power through laughter.
I love that. It's like saying, hey, we're still here, we're thriving, and we're not afraid to laugh at ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly. And it often uses storytelling, wordplay, this playful way of subverting expectations. It challenges those dominant narratives and asserts cultural pride.
It's a reminder that even in the face of all these challenges, Indigenous communities haven't lost their sense of humor. They can still find joy and laughter.
Absolutely. Humor is powerful. It's about resilience, healing, connection. It brings people together, builds bridges, fosters understanding. And even in the midst of all these serious discussions about rights and justice and equality, there's always room for a little laughter.
So true. Well, I think we've covered just about everything we set out to explore in this deep dive. We've defined Indigenous identity, unpacked complex legal concepts, examined the challenges of cultural appropriation, and even celebrated the power of Indigenous humor. It's been a real journey.
It has. We've delved into those legal frameworks, those fascinating cultural concepts. We've learned about the incredible work Indigenous communities are doing to assert their rights, protect their cultures, and shape their own futures.
I feel like I've learned so much. But I also want to say, this is just a starting point. There's so much more to learn about Indigenous rights, both in Mexico and around the world.
Absolutely. We've only scratched the surface, but hopefully we've sparked some curiosity, inspired people to keep learning and engaging with these issues.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize something we've said throughout this whole conversation. Truly recognizing Indigenous rights goes beyond just changing laws or policies.
It does.
It requires a change in societal attitudes, a willingness to listen, learn, and commit to creating a world that's more just and equitable for everyone.
Well said. It's about recognizing the dignity and worth of all people, no matter their background or their history.
It's about dismantling those systems of oppression and building bridges of understanding and respect.
It's about celebrating diversity, seeing the interconnectedness of all living things.
And it's about creating a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, to reach their full potential.
Beautifully put.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a challenge. Take what you've learned and put it into action. Educate yourself, engage in respectful dialogue, support Indigenous-led initiatives, and use your voice to advocate for justice and equality.
Be an ally, an advocate, a champion for Indigenous rights.
Because the fight for Indigenous rights is a fight for a better world for all of us.
A world where all cultures are valued, all voices are heard, and everyone can live in harmony, both with each other and with the earth.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep seeking knowledge, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a more just and equitable world.
And remember, the future we create is up to all of us.